Having a grandmother from the Red Lake Nation, I'd only ever traveled through northern Minnesota to reach her reservation for visits with family in the summer. On those long drives cutting across the state, I was able to witness the beauty of the many types of places this land fosters. I traveled many winding one-lane roads surrounded by trees and extending further and further into forest. I'd even gotten lost with my family on these empty roads once, having to pull over at the first sign of civilization, which happened to be a bar with helpful locals to right our way. It was on these trips that I'd seen a black bear and a gray wolf for the first time, suddenly realizing both how powerful yet fragile they were as they quickly hid from sight. It was also on these trips that I'd breathed the freshest air I'd ever known, crisp and scented with cedar and pine. This is the land my Dakota and Ojibwe ancestors knew so well. This is the land we still fight to protect. These trips ended with us driving back south, each passing mile yielding more and more human development and less wildness. When we'd finally arrived back home in St. Paul, it was the ultimate contrasting view from the one I'd just had a few hours earlier. Every road was packed with cars, every green space intentionally kept or placed so that every inch of the city could be planned. The downtown high-rises and Capitol building are the face of technological advancement and the beginning of this land as a state in the Union. These two places are so different, representing such opposing things, yet still are a part of the same land that has come to be known as Minnesota. Places like St. Paul house the institutions responsible for the outcomes to communities hundreds of miles away, yet can be highly disconnected from them. The leaders of these institutions can also be disconnected from the people of communities like the one in Red Lake. It is important to expose that disconnect so that someday, hopefully soon, we may heal it. Welcome to Indige-Nation, the podcast that covers all topics affecting our Indigenous communities on Turtle Island. This series will focus on the ongoing fight against the construction of the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota. For our first episode, I wanted to cover a bit about how the permitting process works for such a project and why tribal nations in our state have been so opposed to Line 3. I also had the opportunity to speak with Frank Bibeau, a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe and attorney for the native-led environmental nonprofit Honor the Earth. Frank was able to share valuable insights about the history of the Line 3 pipeline, the inequities in the public comment process, as well as his future strategies for protecting the land. Stick around. In December of 2020, construction began through the lands and waters of northern Minnesota on the crude oil pipeline known as Line 3. For the last 7 years, environmental groups, tribal nations, Minnesota state agencies, and the multinational energy corporation Enbridge have been embroiled in a complex approval process for the Line 3 crude oil pipeline. In the handful of years since I learned about the Line 3 pipeline, I myself have submitted public comments, protested with my brother at the Capitol, donated to grassroots organizations, phoned my state representatives, volunteered for political campaigns, and soon want to fundraise for water protectors. Although I fully recognize that I am part of the problem by my participation in our capitalist society, I refuse to be complicit in the continued destruction of the earth and my ancestral homelands for corporate gain when energy alternatives exist. As a citizen of Minnesota, and even more so as a member of the Dakota and Ojibwe nations that are too often disproportionately harmed by extractive industries, I feel an immense responsibility to protect the land and its animals and leave a thriving planet for generations to come. Because although Enbridge continually assures stakeholders that a new pipeline is needed to replace its aging infrastructure and protect the environment, the project still poses numerous immediate and long-term threats to the climate, the water, and the people of Minnesota. The Line 3 pipeline would transport oil from Alberta's tar sands through 337 miles of Minnesota wetlands and forests to be refined in Wisconsin. To make matters worse, the type of oil Enbridge plans to transport is the most energy-intensive to extract, transport, and refine, giving it the highest life cycle greenhouse gas emissions compared to other oil types. The development of this pipeline comes at a critical time when our state and our nation must transition to renewable energy to avoid the more devastating consequences of climate change. Another problem not unique to this pipeline is the threat of leaking, which would be devastating to the interconnected aquatic ecosystems of northern Minnesota and could reach even further as the pipeline crosses the Mississippi River multiple times. It could also cause direct detrimental effects to the people of Minnesota in a multitude of ways. Degraded water quality, decreased access to fresh water sources for consumption, and acute health effects are just some of the risks posed to humans. All of the aforementioned problems and more would unequally impact tribal nations whose reservations are located in northern Minnesota. This is a well-understood fact according to the Line 3 Replacement Environmental Impact Statement. It states that, quote, disproportionate and adverse impacts would occur to American Indian populations in the vicinity of the proposed project. They further acknowledge that impacts to tribal nations would be, quote, magnified with the abandonment of the previous pipeline and replacement in a new location. The route of the new Line 3 pipeline comes into close proximity with multiple tribal nations, even crossing one, the closest points being 3.1 miles from the White Earth Reservation and crossing the southern half of the Fond du Lac Reservation. Although it only crosses the lands of one reservation directly, the pipeline could disrupt multiple tribes' usufructuary rights to hunt, fish, and gather. This includes the harvesting of food staples like wild rice and fishing for species like walleye on treaty lands, both of which are central to Ojibwe identity. Environmental degradation can also negatively impact tribal economies and the health and safety of indigenous tribal members. The influx of pipeline workers from outside the community has also been linked with higher crime rates for offenses like domestic violence, sex trafficking, and drug abuse. This was proven in February of 2021 when 2 Line 3 pipeline workers were arrested in Itasca County in northern Minnesota on charges of, quote, solicitation, one of which was, quote, of a person believed to be a minor. These issues are particularly worrying to tribal communities that may not have the resources to prevent and handle increases in crime. Given that they would bear the greatest burden not only from catastrophic oil spills but also from the construction process itself and a changing climate, tribal nations should expect to have equal representation and involvement in the approval process for such a project. However, many tribes and indigenous activists and their allies have raised concerns over their inclusion in the lengthy process. The process of approving Line 3 includes the authorization of over 30 permits and certifications, which are required before any construction can take place on the pipeline. These certifications and permits must be granted from various local, state, and federal agencies, including the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and local watershed districts. Of these many requirements, 3 in particular granted from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, known by its acronym NPCA, and the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, commonly referred to as the PUC, have been met with the most controversy and public input. These are the Certificate of Need and Route Permit approved by the Public Utilities Commission and the Clean Water Act Section 401 Water Quality Certification approved by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. No permit is more critical for the protection of vulnerable aquatic ecosystems along the proposed pipeline route than the water quality certification. This certification is granted by the MPCA to certify that the project will comply with state water quality standards so long as it meets all conditions stated within the permit. The MPCA provides only one opportunity for public participation in the form of a minimum 10-day public comment period before their final decision is reached. From March 2nd to April 10th of 2020, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency provided an opportunity for public comment. Due to challenges arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, the MPCA allowed for an additional 7-day comment period to the usual 32-day period. They accepted comments via their online platform, mailed letters, and through 3 telephone town halls, which substituted the in-person meetings for public engagement. The MPCA received over 10,000 comments from all 3 sources during this 39-day period, which was 10 times the number received for the controversial Polymet mine. Most of the comments submitted were from concerned citizens and environmental groups raising questions about the impact climate change would have on water quality. The switch to a distance comment period was quickly met with criticism. Chairman Michael Fairbanks of the White Earth Reservation sent a letter to Governor Walz on March 26th, noting that many tribal members lacked access to the scheduled meetings.
The Pollution Control Agency's scheduling telephone town hall meetings and a 1-week extension on the comment period is not really providing for consultation, coordination, and cooperation under Executive Order 19-24. Too often, tribal members do not have the time, resources, and ability to electronically participate in a meaningful way, and they prefer public hearings to speak to share their concerns.
Chairman Fairbanks was referencing Executive Order 1924 issued by Governor Walz in 2019, which stipulated that state agencies must, quote, develop and maintain relationships with tribal governments, quote, consider the input gathered from tribal consultation, and that each agency designate a tribal liaison for the purpose of implementing these goals. Concern was also expressed within some of the comments submitted. One comment by Nancy Bolio, a member of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and an organizer with the nonprofit climate organization MN350, detailed the reasons behind a lack of Native input.
How did MNPCA communicate with Native communities to ensure they were aware of this public comment period during the pandemic? Many of our people, especially our elders, have no access to Wi-Fi to receive alerts or messages pertaining to this matter. Public buildings are closed due to the pandemic. Many of our people use public Wi-Fi to connect, and without Wi-Fi, our people have no way to receive this knowledge to make a comment. I attended all 3 town halls and also observed written comments, and I note the lack of Native input. Once again, failure to inform and consult is not consent.
Although tribal citizens, their leaders, and their allies made their voices clear that they did not support the pipeline, nor did they find the permitting process adequate, the MPCA would still grant Enbridge the water quality certification in November of 2020. This March, I had the pleasure of sitting down to a conversation with Frank Bibeau to further discuss the inequities tribal nations faced while fighting the Line 3 pipeline.
I'm an attorney. I live in Leech Lake Reservation in Ball Club, Minnesota, and I've lived there most of my life. I graduated from William Mitchell back in 2000. And I've been involved in environmental, knowledge and learning. I've got an associate's in science back in 1981, so I've been following a lot of things environmentally for a long time. And as I was living longer here at the reservation and things and doing things legally, Winona and I became friends, Winona LeDuc, a long time ago. And so we've been doing environmental things along the way. And now with Line 3 and the Sandpiper pipeline, those are really the biggest threats that we have to worry about. And so we've been working on that together.
Among his many roles, Frank is also executive director of the 1855 Treaty Authority, as well as an attorney with Honor the Earth. He has also worked on behalf of and consulted with the White Earth and Leech Lake tribes. Some of his most meaningful achievements have been from his work with Winona LeDuc to secure wild rice protections. In 2018, he worked with the White Earth Nation to adopt the Rights of Monoman, which was the first rights of nature law for a plant species. He has also been involved in the fight against Line 3 from the beginning. I first asked Frank if the original Line 3 pipeline was met with resistance.
So the Minnesota Chippewa tribe has 6 reservations, and we're all part of the same tribe. And back in 1963, we were looking at changing our constitution, and we revised our constitution from 1 tribal government to 6 tribal governments on 6 reservations. And so that's almost at the same time when Line 3 was coming through. And so we weren't very sophisticated about what was going on. And at that time, the BIA was still the people who signed off for us. Okay? So we might not have even fully known what was going on. So when the Clipper came through, I was working for Leech Lake Reservation. It was back in like 2008, 2009, whatever. And we were looking at things and trying to figure out what was happening. And they had already been running oil. I forget which line it was. Might have been, I don't remember which line it was now. But anyway, a lease had expired at Fond du Lac on one of the pipelines, and Enbridge hadn't renewed it, which was really weird. But they were still continuing to pump oil. So this is 10 years ago. So as we were checking things out and trying to figure out how to negotiate, because Enbridge hadn't had to deal with these old pipelines as well, the leases had expired and they wanted to get compensation. And at that time, Leech Lake also agreed to the Clipper being put in because we were told that was the last pipeline. There wasn't going to be any more pipelines, and so it seemed okay. So anyway, what had been shared with us was back in about 1963, 64, I think it was a document where Lakehead Pipeline, the predecessor of Enbridge, had made a deal with the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, who was the governing authority at the time, for like, I'll say $864 for a 20-year lease on a pipeline. $864, and they let that lease lapse because they don't care, because they continue to pump for free anyway.
In an opinion piece for the Minnesota Reformer titled "President Biden, Please Stop Enbridge Line 3," Frank expressed his dissatisfaction with public engagement, saying that the hearings conducted remotely, quote, "did not constitute a public process," and that no one could get on the telephone town halls, and even if they did, you only had 2 minutes to tell them why the permits should not be issued. During our conversation, I asked Frank to identify any other instances during the public engagement process that he thought were also unfair.
You know, when you talk about the public process, I remember one time when we were having the evidentiary hearings at the PUC in St. Paul, and there was such a competition for seats that it was like this first come, first serve kind of a deal or something, because they hadn't figured out. They weren't expecting crowds that have been there the whole time. And so that next morning for the hearings, there was a dozen kids, maybe 20 kids, college students, and they all had on these Line 3 support green t-shirts. They got inside and they got their tickets to go into the hearing, and then they left, and they were all laughing about being paid by Enbridge to basically be in line early to prevent other people from participating. There was a meeting like that in Cross Lake with the PUC, and Enbridge had like 4 buses of people come in who were mostly employees to take up the time for public speaking, for the public to participate. So then when you get to the PUC, the PUC is relying on the PCA, the Pollution Control Agency. They're relying on what the ALJ and what the PUC did for the Environmental Impact Statement, the EIS. And in the Environmental Impact Statement, the ALJ says there's no good place to run this route like Enbridge wants to. The best thing that could happen environmentally would be to do an in-trench replacement in the mainline corridor for that system. But that's not what the PUC wanted, and so they said, we don't care about tribal treaty rights and resources. No matter what we do, it's going to be a bad thing. So we're going to let Enbridge have the permit essentially for the route that they want. So when it came to the PCA, they had basically, I guess, thought that the EIS was done in a broad, favorable way, or I mean, not favorable, but fair way. But in actuality, while we had contributed all of our concerns, we had even done an Anishinaabe cumulative impact assessment with the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. None of that was considered by the PUC. They wanted to look at this ditch where the pipe is going in, and then nothing else that's beside it very much. And so when you get to the PCA, and you could look at some of that stuff, Red Lake and White Earth, we submitted 2 documents. We submitted one on April 10th, outlining what we believe our water rights are. And then when that came to a hearing, the ALJ, the administrative law judge, said that these are basically federal rights, and they're a matter of law. So he wasn't going to consider them in the evidentiary hearing what our rights are. So if you're not going to consider our rights in the environmental land, and you're not going to consider our water property rights where you're looking at permitting, where are you going to look at our water quality rights? Well, it ends up that the next thing that happens is the Corps of Engineers says, well, the PCA said go ahead and go. So they said, okay, you can go. So you have a whole bunch of bootstrapping by agencies that don't even really know if the other agencies ever did their job with regards to the environment. They just assumed they did. And so in a sense, that goes back to your same first question. Same shit, different day.
Frank was also able to describe his next steps in the fight against Line 3 and strategies that all tribes could potentially use to protect their treaty rights.
They understand that our rights as tribes, our treaty rights, are much more powerful on reservation. But I believe that our treaty rights are actually powerful off reservation. We just haven't used them the right way. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do is I don't want to call it cutting edge, because it's not cutting edge. This is old concept stuff, really. But what I'm trying to do is change the way our rights are viewed off reservation. Using the rights of nature is one of the things, as well as an off-reservation tribal court. Just recently, the White Earth Reservation adopted an off-reservation part for the tribal court under the conservation code. And so we have a conservation code for the 1855 ceded territory. And in that code, there's a lot of things. I mean, if it's fishing or whatever, I mean, you could get a ticket, you could go to tribal court. But at the same time, we also have in there trespass, because inevitably somebody ends up trespassing to go fishing or trespassing to recover an animal they shot or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so by having that in our code, it means that we still have jurisdiction over that as well as whatever the other infraction is. And so we are looking at, and what we've done, and I don't know if you've looked at both documents or what you've looked at, but with the rights of nature, the rights of nature is two things. One is giving a higher standard of rights for wild rights, I mean, not rights of nature, but rights of monomen, a higher standard of protection for itself, but also it's a defense for tribal members who were out there defending, who are water protectors, who are defending wild rice. That's their reason for being out there, is that's a treaty protected food. And so we have a right to be there. We're not trespassing because we're on territories that we already have a right to be in. And so we've adopted a second code called the Right to Travel, Use and Occupy Traditional Lands and Waters Code. And the Mississippi's obviously traditional waters for the Chippewas of the Mississippi and the lands and the territories and things like that. And so what I saw out at DAPL and KXL, with DAPL in particular, Standing Rock, was that a lot of the charges against the tribal members and non-Indians were based on trespass. Well, if I can undo trespass, then as civil regulatory, which it is, and get it into tribal court, well, then maybe you can't prosecute tribal members for defending their own territories because they aren't trespassing. And maybe the right to assembly can't be used because if you're not trespassing, you may have a right to assemble. They even have a charge watching or attending a right to or an assembly or something like that. And so, right. There were people charged at Standing Rock for unlawful assembly who got together, who were singing and praying. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're just trying to make it fit that way. So what I'm trying to do basically is set up an alternative system based on tribal laws. One is the rights of nature or rights of monomen, and one is our own treaty rights, which is the right to go out and hunt, fish, and gather. And if you have a right to that kind of a food place, then you must obviously have a right to defend it and protect it, because otherwise, if you don't have food, you're just going to starve to death. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of how we're looking at our defenses, whether they're in state court or getting them to tribal court. And hopefully that'll disrupt part of what's going on with the security forces that they're using right now. There's been a lot of people charged for water protecting. Mm-hmm. And so I'm hoping that wild rice is what's going to protect us all. Another strategy that I've been looking at, and I haven't got it put out together entirely yet because I've got things going on, but one of the things I also learned about KXL and DAPL was that they don't have the same control over Indian country like they do in Minnesota under Public Law 280, but they tried to. And this was back in the beginning, back in the 60s. And back then, in order to try to get jurisdiction over Indians, you had to get the consent of the Indians, is what it was determined in 1972. And when the U.S. Supreme Court said you got to get the consent of the Indians, no state ever tried to get jurisdiction over Indians again because they knew we weren't going to agree, And so what I noticed was in those laws, it talks about that the state had to agree to the same federal laws as Public Law 280 Minnesota. And there's an exception to jurisdiction in Part B in the criminal and the civil codes. And what it basically says is that the state cannot encumber or tax or interfere with our rights, much less our rights to including water rights. And when I saw that including water rights, I didn't think about that in Minnesota because we have so much water. It's very abundant. And it's very scarce out there. But in reality, what we have for water rights are the requirement for wild rice to be productive. And that means good, clean water. We also, in our treaty journals, we talked about the fish and the maple. And so if you're going to have a fishery, you got to have abundant, clean water. If you're going to have a lot of maple syrup, you got to have abundant, clean water. And so what that told me was our water rights under what they call the Winters Doctrine is essentially to have very clean water in our environment for our food sources that we talked about reserving for ourselves back in the 1800s when we first made our treaties. Mm-hmm. That's the same arguments that have been used out on the West Coast, where they had a case out there you might have heard sometimes called Salmon versus Culverts. And in that case, that's the nickname for it. They basically, in Washington State, they have a bunch of culverts that were preventing the salmon from migrating upstream to where they would spawn and reproduce and then go back out to the ocean and come back. And so they were having to dismantle and change the way something like $3 billion worth of culverts are operating so that the salmon can get back for the Indians to eat their treaty food. Mm-hmm. Now, if it's going to cost $3 billion to return salmon, then I don't know how a $3 billion or $2 billion project for Enbridge for Line 3 even matches up, much less with greenhouse emissions and climate change and things like that. You know, so I don't think the state or the federal government is looking at this puzzle the right way. And I think that our water rights are going to be what ends up saving everybody, because I believe, and this is from all the reading of different things, I believe our treaties are so unique that they will actually require our consent, and they don't want to even think about that, neither the state nor the federal government. But we had some federal cases here a couple of years ago that I was one of the lead people in terms of the what do we call it, the legal expertise or whatever, you know, the background guy who does all the reading and stuff. Mm-hmm. And so what the judge said was that our treaties are separate and apart from the state of Minnesota and from the federal government. And the reason that he said that, which is very interesting, especially for what we're doing, is, where are you from?
The Twin Cities area, and yeah, and then
okay, that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, you might have seen these kinds of movies, but out west, every once in a while, you would see where there's these like big gorges, and the Columbia River and things, and they have these big long sticks with a round net, and they dip a fish out of that river. I don't know if you've ever seen that kind of fishing or not, but anyway, it's okay. You'd know if you had seen it. You're a little young, that's why I was.
Yeah, I don't think so.
And so when they did that, those treaties say that the Indians have the right to fish in the customary and usual places in common with the citizens of the territory or in common with the citizens of the United States, because they weren't states yet, and they were saying that the white people had the same right to fish as the Indians did in all those places. In our treaties, it says in 1842 that all the lands that have been ceded and all the lands yet to be ceded are held in common by the Chippewa of the Mississippi and the Chippewa of Lake Superior. And so that means our rights are not combined or in common with anybody from the United States or the state. And I believe that's where consent comes in from the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. And I think consent is the place that we've all been waiting for with our Indian treaties, because if you ask us, you know, we tell you with the Corps of Engineers, the answer is no. Consultation, the answer is no. You ask us with the PCA, the answer is no. No doesn't mean jack shit to these people. You have to sue them and get to show them that you have the right to say no, and no means no.
I want to say Nina Wopida and Miigwech to Frank Bibeau for joining our podcast today and for the lifetime of work he has put into protecting his community, Mahnomen, the land, and the water. I've also got to say that even though the fight against Line 3 may seem daunting, our conversation filled me with hope and excitement at all of the potential legal strategies tribes can take now and in the future to protect our rights and resources. I share the belief that our rights to wild rice and clean water are so far-reaching that they could be what saves us all. Thank you all for listening. Until we meet again, Dokshta Ake.